I know Spartacus, you filmed it a while ago, but it just wrapped up on TV. Were you sad to see that end, or did you feel like, no, the story was done?
It's a toughie, mate. We there were so many mixed feelings. I mean, internally within our group of people who made Spartacus, that we had to let it go, But at the end of the day, I think it was the right choice. We could have gone another season, no doubt. No doubt. The ratings were there, the popularity was there, the storyline was there to play with. But you know what? It was one of those choices that Stephen DeKnight, our main writer, he and I guess a couple of the people from Stars, they decided, you know what, we're high on this one. We've had great tragedy like losing Andy Whitfield. We'd overcome incredible obstacles to be able to continue as a show. I mean, for so many reasons, our show became popular through great effort, and it would have been a real shame if we'd made all of that effort to not finish on an absolute high, and I think what we did was we finished on an absolute high, and we managed to pull it off. And as much as it feels kind of like, wow, saying goodbye to something that was so rewarding, it's like that moment where you got to take your graduation hat off and just throw it in the air and say, hey, you know what, it's done. Let's move forward.
Yeah, and the show was kind of groundbreaking in how violent it was at times. Yeah,
well, the world's a violent place, and there was no punches pulled. There was a true attempt, I think, by our writers to ingratiate the audience with what it desires from a television viewer perspective, as well as to honor the story that has lasted 2,070 odd years, which is about the underlings of a Roman Empire who want to achieve something for themselves, something of a life, something of self-respect, something of so they will be noticed on this earth, and those characters were just so richly written. I've had this conversation with so many people who picked up on the show, that at first they were like, oh, I could never stand that sort of violence, but once they got into the storylines of the individual characters, they realized it was much more than that. And, but, at the same time also, how could you watch Spartacus? Looking back on it, how could you watch Spartacus without having any of that violence or that sexual material in it? I mean, it's like, who would have watched Jaws if you never saw the shark or any of the attacks,
That's a very good point. And you go right from Spartacus into the new Hobbit movies where you play a key role, Azog the Defiler. What's it like to be part of the Hobbit legacy?
Ridiculously excited. I mean, when you get a phone call saying, Peter Jackson wants you to play the penultimate bad guy of J.R. Tolkien's world, I went to all the Lord of the Rings movies and was like, my God, it's incredible what we can do with cinema these days, And at the same time, I was coming off toward the end of Spartacus, I was doing Spartacus 5 days a week, and then kind of like, needing to go and work with Peter on my times off. So the whole thing was a very sudden thing that happened whilst I was still sort of busy, but wondering what was going to happen after Spartacus. I was thinking like, this has been such a great show. How can I move in any direction and feel like it's going to be as fulfilling as this 4-year journey as Crixus? And then the phone rang and it's Peter Jackson. You want to come down to Wellington and play Azog the Defiler. And it was funny because, when I heard that name, I rang up my manager and I said, how am I going to play Azog the Defiler? What is that? And she goes, and she's German, and she went like, oh, Manu, you just have to be a perverse Hobbit torturer.
That could be the best job description ever.
Oh, it was mate, it was hilarious, especially with her accent. And I kind of, but I just went, I sort of thought about it, and I went to the video store and I got out The Empire Strikes Back, and I got out Jaws, because I've been shown an image of Azog, and to me he seemed like he needed that huge kind of prowess and presence of a dictator, and I sort of thought that one of the greatest filmic versions of a dictator is, of course, or a presence like that is Darth Vader. And then on top of that, I really wanted to get a good voice. Originally they'd filmed Darth Vader with an American actor, and he had this very tinny American twang to everything that he said. And I know it was George Lucas's intention, but they got James Earl Jones to voice it over to make it Joy in the Darks, that voice. So, I knew I had a big challenge on my hand to create a voice. What I didn't know was that he spoke a different language called black speech. So when I arrived down at the studios with Peter Jackson, they gave me these scripts, and it was like this thing called black speech, which is like a Germanic kind of language. And they said, look, sorry, we've got to throw this at you straight away, but this is the dialogue, and I don't know whether you can learn it in the next few minutes before we throw you on camera. I mean, this all happened that fast. I'll just backtrack a little bit. Peter Jackson had cast a couple of 7-foot guys originally to play Azog, and then they decided that they weren't getting the performance out of these tall, athletic guys, so they decided that they'd create Azog in the same fashion that they created Gollum with Andy Serkis, and that involves the process of motion capture. And motion capture, for people who don't understand, is when you put on this suit and your physical movement becomes read by a computer. And then basically they can put whatever skin over the top of you, an animated CGI skin that will create you to be the character, Like Andy Serkis, who played Gollum, also played King Kong in the last King Kong movie.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's become a very well-known motion capture artist. Funnily enough, I met him just before I started working with Peter Jackson at the San Diego Comic-Con and had like about a 2-hour conversation with him at this after party about motion capture. And then 2 months later, here I am down in Wellington, and somebody's actually handing me these shoes that he wore to play Gollum, saying, "Oh, these are the shoes Andy wore. Do you want to wear them? I think you're both size 9.5." Like,
so in that conversation you guys had at San Diego Comic-Con, did he give you pointers just by chance? You know what I mean?
Well, he didn't know, and I didn't know I was going to end up playing Azog. Look, I know that at one stage during our conversation, I said to him, look, one thing I got to say is when you played King Kong, there was a moment where King Kong was sitting on the cliff, and he just caught Naomi Campbell, and she was sort of behind him in the cave, and she just came out of being unconscious. She screamed and fainted, and she was just coming to, and King Kong is sitting there looking out at the sun. It's either setting or it's rising, and he's looking out, and his eyes have this kind of, gorilla emotion.
Yeah.
And he picks up this little bit of tree that's next to him, and he looks at it, as though he's going to eat it and have a snack, but he feels a bit melancholy, so he sort of throws it off to the side. And that little bit of emotion, that little bit of performance there really stood out for me, because it was like, in the original King Kong movies back in the 70s or 80s or whatever, King Kong just had glass eyes like those dolls, where the heads roll back and the eyes close, and then you roll them forward and they're frozen. And that to me is where motion capture allows you to build characters that otherwise would be animated and not have human qualities or have qualities of emotion. And what Peter Jackson said to me after I'd done the performance with Azog is he said to me, Manu, the thing that really stands out is how you're using your eyes and how we're getting the ability to see the thinking mechanism behind Azog, because I think that's what was missing for him in the original performances. So, look, it was that's technical jargon and all that sort of stuff, but it's such a privilege, man. I'm a lucky guy. I'm a very lucky guy.
Yeah, very, very much so. You're playing these iconic characters. Can you tell us a little bit about the next chapter, the Hobbit, the Desolation of Smaug?
I have no idea. As a matter of fact, I was just on the phone to my manager asking whether I could get a script. I'm going to go film it next month. Yeah. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, Peter, he's taken me on as an actor I think he trusts, and I know. First of all, the first thing we do is we do the motion capture, we do the movement, and those things don't involve that. We do the dialogue at the same time, but the dialogue is actually added on later in a studio environment where we work on the voice independently and we create the lines. So there's plenty of time for me to get the material and prepare for this, but no, I actually don't have any insights, except for the fact that, I'm really going to try to bring more thinking into the process with Azog, so that I know, the things that I really appreciated about Andy Serkis's performance is just the amount of personal character that he puts into Gollum, I mean, you're just constantly wondering where Gollum is going with his mind. You know, Azog's a different species, a different character altogether. You know, and I do base him on these more iconic sort of bad guy roles like Darth Vader or Jaws, you know, but he has still these characters, just if you catch a glimpse of how they think, you know, then all of that size and all of that power and all of that might gets absorbed, you know, and an audience can sort of link into that character with more understanding. And I think that's sort of important. It's rather broad way to describe it, but I think it's really important. Just like King Kong sitting watching that sunset when Andy did it. Anybody listening to this radio, watch the scene in King Kong where he's staring at the sunset and look at his eyes. It was genius. It was Andy Serkis going like nothing else is going on right now with his character but something that he's thinking of in his little guerrilla life.
It gives those big monsters something that we can relate to as normal people, which I think is what's important.
Hey, look, during the filming, you know, I was wondering how I could characterize Azog to have some sort of grounding, you know, something that tied him into his environment. And at the time, I'm just standing in this open studio with nothing but a big pommel horse, like a gym pommel horse that I had to climb on top of that was sort of green screened. And you know, Peter Jackson said to me, that thing there's a giant wolf called a Warg. And you're going to be riding that in the movie, you know. There's going to be several scenes where you're going to be on top of that. And so I said to Peter, can I have a relationship with my Warg? And the whole room went silent. It was like, oh, the actors asked Peter if he can do something. God, he's just meant to act. And Peter kind of like stepped out from behind the console with his bare feet, because he wanted his bare feet all the time. He went, excuse me, you know what? And I said, well, listen, like, you know, I mean, you've got the Lone Ranger and Silver, right? Like, you know, everybody knows that whenever he whistles, Silver's going to arrive, you know. He's going to jump on his back, and, you know, so he's just there, you know. There's a relationship. You got Lassie and all these sort of other sort of animals that have these relationships, you know. Like, surely Azog must have some relationship with this Warg. So Peter said, yeah, of course, yeah. How do you want to do it? And I said, well, you know, there's a couple of scenes, like in the first scene where the orcs, well, I'm first discovered in this giant castle, you know, and these orcs come in and they're like, oh, sire, we're so sorry, you know, we lost the dwarves, you know, they've gotten away, and I could have turned around at that moment, and you would have known the end of the scene. I could have just turned around and said, I wanted the head of the dwarf king. You know, I could have hit them really hard with that, and you would have known that I was just going to go and rip their throats out. But instead, I said to Peter, okay, I'm going to try it here. And so I just turned around and I just walked over to this Warg and I patted its head, and I said to the Warg, I wanted the head of the Hobbit king, the dwarf king, you know. So he didn't even really know where he was coming from. But what I was telling him, but basically instead of using that line to them, I used it to my Warg in order to tell him that he was about to get fed.